Thanks, David. I hope you all had a restful weekend. And working for a government department, I'm the one person in the room who does have a BlackBerry. And in fact, I inherited that from my predecessor. So you can be rest assured we're trying to take care of your tax revenues, not spending them on new gadgets. So I work in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the Climate Change and Energy Department. Now that's a very deliberate juxtaposition of two themes, climate change and energy, because they're two sides of the same coin. So we work together on aspects of climate change, but also on energy. But my role is very much on the energy side of things rather than the climate change. Okay, so why does the Foreign Office have an energy department? Well, there's the traditional approach to this, which has been about the themes of UK security of supply, about investment, both inward investment into this country and outward investment. Our major IOCs going out and investing in overseas, so kind of inward and outward investment. And then there's the climate change agenda, which is very important for the UK government. So that's been the traditional approach to why the FCO is interested in energy. But increasingly what we're trying to do is stand in the shoes of other countries and think about how they think about their energy issues. Because energy is such a central issue for any country that it shapes the way they look at their foreign policy. So it's very important for us to stand in the shoes of other countries and think about how they think about energy, because that is such a central issue in the way they shape their foreign policy. So it's very important to understand that. And that applies both to countries which are importers of energy, customers of energy, but also to countries which are suppliers of energy. So understanding that dynamic and how those customers and suppliers interact with each other is very important for how we position our foreign policy. The other kind of aspects of context, really, when we do our work is, we're about supporting production of oil and gas. Now, you might think that is kind of a little bit of a contradiction when it comes to the aspects of climate change, but we don't see it that way because of a couple of reasons, really. Firstly, we're going to need oil and gas in the future. Even if we substantially reduce the use of oil and gas, we're still going to need it. Transportation in particular is very dependent on oil. At the moment, there's no viable technologies which can easily substitute for that. Gas is very important in the power sector and will continue to be important in the power sector. And gas-fired power is an important backup to renewables, so it fits together there. We're also interested in reducing demand, and the reasons for that are twofold, really. By reducing demand, you make energy more affordable, so it has a security of supply aspect to it, but also from a climate change point of view, it's good to reduce demand. And finally, as I say, the whole climate change agenda is very important and up there as one of our priorities. If anybody hasn't looked at it, I can recommend some of these slides are taken from the BP Energy Outlook to 2035. So if you've got some spare time and you want a kind of good summary of where we're going in energy, I would recommend having a look at that. It's put together in a very accessible form and is available on their website. So, what are the big themes? Starting on the left here, this is the consumption by region. So, the thing that really jumps out here is OECD demand is pretty flat out to 2035. The big growth in demand is China, and then later on, kind of on the 2020s onwards, it's India. So 95% of the growth in consumption is coming from the non-OECD, specifically China, which has important implications for where the energy is going to be sourced from and how it's going to transfer to the consuming nations. By sector, one of the interesting things here is the growing importance of electrification in energy. Electrification, as our lives are becoming more and more electrified. We have more and more gadgets, and then again with the climate change agenda, heating transferring to heat pumps. Virtually every new technology that comes along is increasing the share of electrification in the economy. So the kind of share of primary energy that's going into the power sector is going to grow and will become more than 50% by the end of the outlook period. And then by fuel, what we're seeing is gas is growing fastest in terms of consumption. Oil is growing slowest. Surprisingly, coal is still growing quite fast. That's primarily in the power sector, and the demand is the usual countries of China and India. But coal is not yesterday's fuel. It's still very much an important fuel of the future. And what we're seeing, or what BP see in terms of the outlook, is because of those relative growth rates, you're seeing a convergence of oil, coal and gas in terms of share of primary energy, and they're converging at about 27% each. So by 2035, BP predicts that 81% of our primary energy will still come from the fossil fuels. Renewables are growing relatively fast, compound growth rate of 7%, but because you're coming from such a small base, that compound growth is still kind of, because you're growing off a low base, you don't end up with a massive share in the out years. So, and the other assumption in their projections is that there'll be no major nuclear renaissance. So that the share of nuclear in the mix is still relatively small in the out years. I mean, of course, that varies by country. Some countries are very heavily dependent on nuclear, like France, but others like Germany have said they're not going to have any nuclear. So it varies a lot by country. Okay, so we have to bear in mind that comes back to what I was saying earlier on, that oil and gas is still very important for the future, and we need to kind of pay attention to those as we go forward. In terms of import dependency, there's some interesting figures here from the IEA which look at the import dependency in both oil and gas, oil along the horizontal axis and gas on the vertical axis. What you can see here is the kind of very obvious trend that everybody is becoming more dependent on imports apart from the United States. So the US will, by 2035, be a gas exporter. So it's becoming, as you can see, the trend there to a gas exporter. It will still be an oil importer, but those oil imports will be coming most likely from Canada. So North America as a whole will achieve oil independence, inverted commas, but not actually the United States. However, the US will still import the oil price, if you can think of it that way. So it still will be linked to the world market through the mechanism of the oil price. So we don't really know how that's going to impact US foreign policy, but it's an important thing to be aware of, that the kind of relationship of the US to the global market is changing. Now, for the other countries, you can see, and the other regions, their import dependency is going up quite dramatically. If you look at the European Union, gas imports going up from about 60% today to above 80% in 2035. So the whole the need to kind of look at diversification of supplies is very important, and that comes down to both diversification of supplies of gas, but also diversification of energy sources. So, for example, renewables is not just a climate change issue, it's also an energy security issue, because being able to diversify your supplies is important for security of supply and climate change. The other thing to kind of bear in mind, I think, with this import dependency is that the kind of trade flows are going to change quite dramatically. So, for example, China, in the last kind of decade, has run a major current account surplus, whereas as it imports more and more energy, it's going to have to pay for that. So, and the US has been the opposite. It's run a major current account deficit. So as that import dependency changes, I think the kind of the trade surplus issue is going to change quite dramatically, and that's kind of a rather under-researched area of economic policy. To what extent that will impact economic policy and the financial dynamics of the world is something I haven't seen a lot of comment on, but I think it's going to be quite an important factor going forward. One of the interesting aspects of the BP study was really a kind of one of the kind of ways that they encapsulated their work was to say the supply is assured. So there's no shortage of oil and gas in the world, no physical shortage. Security is mixed, and that really comes back to the point I was making on the last slide about import dependency, because you've got to get the oil and gas from the producing country to the consuming country, and the trade flows and the transportation. There's some issues around that. But sustainability is poor, was their comment. And what they meant by that was that the climate change aspects of the emissions are quite severe. So the graph on the left shows BP's predicted emissions by region. So OECD is actually reducing its emissions, whereas you can see the non-OECD emissions are going up dramatically. And the little red dotted line and the IEA 450 scenario. The IEA 450 scenario, for those of you who don't kind of follow these things very closely, the IEA 450 scenario is their scenario which is broadly consistent with a 2-degree climate change. So to hit 2 degrees C, we should be seeing a peak in emissions in the next few years, whereas the BP predictions are that is not going to happen under current policies. And then when you look at the emissions per capita by various countries and regions, some kind of quite interesting things are happening. So, for example, the US remains a high emitter per capita. Don't forget these are per capita figures, but is reducing. The EU is making good progress in reducing its emissions. But the interesting point here is that China, on a per capita basis, will actually cross over with the EU in 2017. So on a per capita basis, China will be a greater emitter than the European Union quite soon. And that really comes down to the way their economy is evolving and the way their industry is evolving. If you look at India, for example, India has got quite low emissions, and that's really down to the type of industry that they have and the way their industry is evolving. It's still quite a rural economy, and to the extent that they have more services in their economy than China does, which China has a lot of manufacturing. So when it comes to the negotiations around climate change, this kind of switch over in who's actually doing the emitting is quite an important factor. So we've got the next 2 years, we've got 2 very important meetings coming up. So there's a meeting every year under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. There's a Conference of Parties meeting, and this year in December it's in Lima, Peru, and that's an important meeting because next year in Paris, in December 2015, there's the big convention on climate change, and that is trying to push towards a global deal that will replace Kyoto. So the next 2 years are very important from a kind of climate change negotiation point of view, and getting to an agreement is a priority for the UK government. Changing topic slightly, talking about sector governance in the sector. This is very important for the UK to support best practice in governance, and making sure. And the reason for supporting best practice in governance is to make sure that the benefits of developing natural resources actually go to the host nation, and the host nation benefits fully, and that those resources are not misused. So there's a number of pieces of best practice that we support. We have the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, which is about having transparency in where revenues go, and countries sign up to EITI, and it's to make sure that your revenues, it's very clear which companies are paying what and where those go to, so people can track that against the national income and make sure those revenues are going to the right place. The second one is the voluntary principles on security and human rights. And this is governments, NGOs and companies sign up to the voluntary principles. And that is really all about how operations are conducted, especially in difficult to operate regions. So regions where there's conflict, and making sure that those operations are conducted in the right way. The third initiative is the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Companies. And this is for companies that are in the private security industry to sign up to. And they can sign up to the code, but more importantly, they can actually join the association. And it's a Swiss-based body that has a set of standards for how private security companies should operate in conflict zones. So we support those 3 initiatives of best practice and governance in the sector. And the last one is about fossil fuel subsidies. That kind of relates back to the point I was making earlier on about trying to reduce consumption of fuel, because the more you subsidize fuel, then it encourages wasteful consumption. And the cost burden of that often falls, or it does fall, on the taxpayers of the countries that are providing the subsidy. So it's quite important to eliminate that. But it's a very complex area and difficult to implement. Just to give you an idea of the scale of the issue around cost subsidies, the IEA believes that they're costing governments around the world $550 billion. I say that number again, $550 billion a year. That's a pretty big number by anybody's reckoning. It's not all doom and gloom. There's been some quite good progress. Countries like India and Nigeria have actually made some quite substantial progress in reducing subsidies. It's a challenge to completely eliminate them. You often have a lot of interests involved in the subsidization process, both the consumers and other people involved in the chain. So it's often very difficult to eliminate subsidies. But success usually has a number of component parts. One is it needs to be a gradual process. if you kind of just eliminate subsidies on a Tuesday, then you're probably going to have riots in the street. So you need to have a gradual process. You need to have a safety net to protect the poor. So if you eliminate a subsidy on, let's say, petroleum products, then eliminating that subsidy for the guy driving the big 4x4 is a good idea. But you know, the very poor person who's cooking on a kerosene stove, it's more problematic. So you need to have a safety net for supporting the very poor. And it often helps to have visible projects that you're saving money, but what are you spending that money on? If it's just disappearing into a big pot and getting spent on general government expenditure, then public support for eliminating subsidies is often not that great. So if you can have visible projects which say the money that I've saved by eliminating a subsidy, I'm now spending on this education project, for example, or this new railway, is good for getting public support. But an important but difficult area. What's happening with the clicker? There we go. Another reason that we have an energy department in the Foreign Office is that the UK has a lot of comparative advantage in this sector. It's part of, I would say, part of the UK brand. If you look at Germany, they're fantastically well known for their great cars. If you look at France, their wine and their tourism industry. For the UK, the energy industry is one of our areas where we excel. So we need to we shouldn't hide that under our light under a bushel. We should be out there promoting it. So it's very important. We've got leading IOCs and leading companies. Apologies if I haven't included your company on this list. We've got respected regimes, regulatory regime. We've got a proven track record offshore. We have the City of London, which is a global centre for financing and energy trading. We have the research and teaching institutions, Heriot-Watt University, Robert Gordon University, University of Dundee, Centre for Energy Law and Government. We've got a great reputation and a leading voice in a lot of the international fora. So it's an area where we have comparative advantage and we should be promoting. And we have strength in depth in this sector. This is a slide from our UKTI colleagues. UKTI is a joint agency of BIS and the FCO, and you may not be aware, but there's some changes afoot in UKTI where we're changing the emphasis in the way the UKTI operates. So the traditional support for smaller projects is going to be outsourced to chambers of commerce in relevant countries, whereas the UKTI dedicated staff are going to concentrate on high value opportunities, which tend to be a high value opportunity is defined as an opportunity which has more than 500 million pounds of spend, and a UK accessible proportion of that has to be at least 200 million. So there's a whole chain of UK companies, UK based companies involved in the area, right from the kind of IOCs and the major explorers at the top, down to the supply chain companies at the bottom. So UKTI supports throughout the value chain. Just wrapping up. UK is important input for foreign policy, but also for others. The way that energy trade is changing, is emerging. The trade patterns are changing. Renewables are important and growing fast, but the fossil fuels remain a very important source of supply for the UK. And the next 2 years are very important from a climate change agreement point of view. We support good governance. The North American situation we've touched on is very important to kind of keep aware of that. And the UK comparative advantage. It's an important sector for the UK and we need to support it. Thank you.
Any questions? Well, where is actually policy formulated for the UK? Because
Energy policy.
the policy you talked about, and in particular, it is true we have a leading role as a country because of all the things you said. How does that fit in with the EU, for example, where Germany, as you say, has no experience of running oil and gas policy, really?
Right. Well, oil and gas policy from a UK point of view, domestic point of view, is DEC, not the Foreign Office.
Right.
So I think probably one of the good ways of illustrating this is around the climate change negotiations. So DEC lead on UK climate change negotiations. So it will be DEC officials and DEC ministers who will be negotiating for the UK in the climate change negotiations. But the Foreign Office role in that is to support those negotiations and use our network throughout all the embassies around the world to figure out where other countries are coming from, what are the inputs, who are the key players in the other countries, and supporting the DEC process. So we don't make energy policy in this country. That's the responsibility of DEC, but we support it where we can through our network.
Okay. Yeah, please. Yeah. Just Terry will bring the microphone down. If you could say who you are and which company you're with, please.
Thank you. My name is Bob Lambert with Petra Petroleum. My question is more one of general policy, security of supply, basically. In the last, say, 3 or 4 months, there have been 3 major headlines which on their own seem quite innocuous, or some of them do, but joined together they present a worrying picture. I'd like your comments, please. The first one that I recall was the headline of the UK shutting down 2 of its remaining 3 deep mines for coal. Second one was the announcement of an import contract for Russian coal on a long-term basis, which will eventually supply 40% of the UK's needs. And the third one is the one that we all know about, the Russian expansionism into Eastern Europe. And there seemed to be a long-term connection between these things. And I wonder if anyone's really thinking about it.
Yeah. I mean, most of this is under DEC's responsibility, so I can't stray too far into it. But I think the UK deep mining situation is about economics, fundamentally. And, it's much cheaper to import coal than mine it in this country when you're competing with Indonesian and Colombian open cast mining. Deep mining in this country is, it's difficult to make the economics work. And I think that kind of answers the second question around Russian coal as well. I mean, this isn't really a security issue with coal because it's such a fungible commodity. If somebody said, well, I'm not going to sell you my coal anymore, you just bring in a ship from Colombia and or Indonesia and the fact that your contract with other countries fallen over, I don't think it's an energy security issue. In terms of Russia, I think the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister have already set out the implications of what's happening in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and specifically the Foreign Secretary made a speech at the Lord Mayor's banquet about the consequences of Russia continuing to operate in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. So I don't really want to comment further on that.
But it was the connection between the 3 that I was referring to. Our increased dependency on Russia for certain important fuels.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, the Foreign Secretary made it clear that we're going to be working with the EU to increase energy diversification, working on things like import terminals, working on things like interconnections between countries, gas interconnections, and supporting those projects of common interest. So the UK is going to play its part through the EU in working on those energy diversification strategies. I don't think it's particularly linked to coal, though, I would say.
Yeah, please. Same if you could say who you are and where you're from. Thanks.
I am Garmaji. I'm from So I'm Grant Rudgley. I'm from a consultancy called Vision Gain. My question is just, you mentioned at the end there, coordinating with European partners on energy supply. With the Groningen gas field going into structural decline going forward, are you working at all with the Dutch government on coordinating gas imports? You mentioned their import terminals.
Yeah, we have, as you're probably aware, we have the interconnector with the continent. So,
is there any further measures? Because that's going to be a big hole. Is the UK looking to be any kind of import hub or any?
Well, we already are an import hub. We've got 3 LNG receiving terminals. Yes. We have supply from Norway. We have the interconnector to the continent. We also have the BBL pipeline. So, we already have a lot of interconnections with the continent. And if you look at the prices at NBL, the National Balancing Point, they're very closely correlated with the Dutch title transfer point. So, the markets are very closely connected.
Okay, so there's enough liquidity there for you right now that there's no more measures on top of this?
Well, I think the UK is pretty well connected, has good infrastructure. A lot of these projects of common interest are around linking up areas which are not interconnected. So, for example, I think the Iberian Peninsula has 6 LNG import terminals, but not very strong links into the rest of the European network. So making sure that those links are made kind of improves the energy security for Europe.
Okay. Tom, please.
Tom Martin, Island GIS. A question in 2 parts. How much of the influence the FCO projects is done at an international level for oil and gas companies, and how much is actually done in country at a local level? And the second part is, being a diplomatic brat and having seen how the FCO has changed over the years and there's been a decrease in footfall and how many people are involved, is this ability to project influence at a local level going to be significantly impacted on in the next few years?
Okay, so at the local level, if you're a big player in a particular country, you'll have almost certainly a relationship with the people in the embassy. So there's often an energy officer located in an embassy. In the smaller embassies, they may have, it might be part of their job, so they might have an economic role as well as an energy role. But if you're operating in a country, your first port of call will be the country concerned. But at a central level, we have kind of overarching relationships, especially with the big companies. So the big IOCs, we have central relationships, and we kind of check in with them on a regular basis, saying, what's your concerns, what's your major priority. But that's not exclusive. I mean, it's an open door kind of thing. If people want to come in and talk, it's not. There's no special channel for particular companies. In terms of resources, well, I mean, it's just a challenge of government, really, quite frankly, to deal with the priorities. Energy has to take its place in the queue, I'm afraid.
Okay. All right. Anybody else? Please. Back there.
Thank you very much. First of all, my name is Kirsten from KR Enviro Consult. I was wondering, as a follow-up to some of the previous questions, which were heading towards our supply security, and also obviously in your field of play of foreign security, international cooperation. Is the FCO working with our international oil majors to, as David was indicating, explore new ideas which could be the renewables as a field of future exploration? Thank you.
I think, we're not geologists, so no, we're not working with them on that. I mean, we're obviously always happy to listen to their views on these matters. Specifically on shale, I think shale, is, in Europe is potentially an important element of security, gas supply security. So I think the UK position on that is that we would like to see shale developed in Europe, and we don't want European legislation that's going to get in the way of that. We think it should be a national competence for countries to decide their own policies.
Just to follow up, because I think maybe I didn't express myself very clearly, but also to encourage looking at new forms of renewables. I mean, you hear of these islands of plastic swimming around in the sea, in the north, in the south. I mean, these are all items which have been made from hydrocarbons. Are we looking towards a completely new future once this becomes financially feasible? And is there any way to strengthen the independence of UK's economy from whoever by looking at truly new ideas?
Okay, well, yes, we do. UK does support new renewable resources, whether that's tidal, whether that's, we've already got a very well-developed wind sector. Solar is less applicable in this country, but new ideas like tidal are definitely out there. But this is really an area for DEC about which renewable, which one they spend their research money on.
I think we have one. Were you waving? Yeah. One more question, and then we need to move on. Or you can do without lunch.
Sam Maszewski, Vision Gain, thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. Since you mentioned shale gas, I was wondering what are the ongoing collaboration or policy developments with your colleagues in Warsaw on shale gas developments? Has there been anything new on that, and how does it fit within the EU policy objectives? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier on, the UK position on this is that this should be an area of national competence. So governments should decide their own regulatory regime about how they want to manage their own sector. We don't particularly want new legislation at the EU level to govern how shale is exploited.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you very much.